All right. Welcome to this month's OBT Reading Group. Today we're going to be reading or discussing the article Community Participation in OBT Quality Assurance from the United Bible Society's Bible Translator Journal, Volume 76. Just very excited about the possibilities of where this conversation could go. I hope you all had a chance to read the article. And yeah, so let's go ahead and dive in. Does anybody have anything that they would like to throw out as a as an opening question or comment? I'll give you a moment. If not, I can give you a prompt. At the very beginning, I really like where he makes the comment, though the translator may receive the most recognition, all are necessary. And in OBT, it is especially the community that is responsible for testing the accuracy, clarity, and naturalness of the translation. And he goes on later to say that the consultant is still involved in the accuracy, or I'm sorry, in the in the accuracy checking, but it's really supposed to be the community itself that owns the process and is the one that's responsible for this testing. And I was just wondering how does that strike you? What do you think about that? And how is that different from a written process?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the prompt? I had to step away for 1 second.
I was going to say I can edit out the crickets later. Yeah, just he mentions in the opening section, he talks about though the translator may receive the most recognition, all are necessary. And in OBT, it is especially the community that is responsible for testing the accuracy, clarity, and naturalness of the translation. And so I'm just wondering a couple of things there. One, how does that statement strike you? What does it make you think? Um, and then two, how does that differ from the quality assurance process in a written translation project?
Hmm.
Because I think a lot of times we try to draw distinctions about, oh, this is distinct about OBT. This is something that applies in OBT. But when I hear it, sometimes I think, but that seems like it should also apply in a written project as well. And so I don't know if the distinction about, this applies in OBT necessarily always connects and isn't present in a written because that's sometimes one of the arguments of well yeah but we do that in written and I don't ever want it to be us versus them. We talk so much about multimodality and
Hmm.
not having that false dichotomy of us versus them. And so, if we can draw the parallels and see where there's overlap in our processes, I think that gives us sort of a shared connection with people that are working in written projects as well.
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, you often hear Bible translation, at least on a written side, when OBT people talk about it, almost caricatured. They have the idea of a Westerner coming in, by himself, learning the language, creating the translation, giving it to the community, and then just walking away. But surely that's not how translation, uh, I mean, maybe it's been done like that somewhere, but that's
Uh,
not typically, even in written situations, what people
there
are
are
aiming for.
historical examples of exactly that.
Yeah, right. But we would say that is probably not the norm or should be the norm.
Right.
But I appreciated the emphasis on the community. I mean, if the translation is to be accepted and used, it has to be driven by the community and not be viewed as, some outside organization coming in to do it. Um, yeah, so long-term sustainability, the community has to be in the driving seat.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's more and more part of the conversation now than it has been in the past. Robin?
Yeah, Chris, I've just been trying to look through about what he said about genius, the genius of a language. And I think if you connect it to when he was describing the community testing part, there were some things that I thought were really special in there. So
Mhm.
I don't know if this exactly answers your question, but I think it I'm trying to answer it, this way. When he talks about having the community listen and then spend some time observing, and it may be difficult for insiders to do that, and so training is needed for these particular elements of watching. Sorry, I was just trying to look through and find what I had read. This okay, so watching for shows of emotion on the face of the listeners.
Yeah.
Um, those are the pieces that I think make it distinctive. So, yes, it's important that the community owns the translation. And I think that that's true in written translation as well. But I don't know if it's grasped in the same way. So, it is something that could be adapted for any type of translation. But this part of you know, paying attention to the audience's reactions,
Mhm.
looking for a show of emotion. Why is the group laughing? Why are they silent? What's the change of expression? Not to assume what those mean. And maybe the community members have a better sense of what that is. And so maybe some training of like document these things so you can understand, like you're being very intentional about asking. Because this is the part where the translators are there. There's no outsider there. They're just
Right.
doing that within the community. And so um, we always say that it's hard to evaluate maybe some aspects of why you do that.
Yeah.
And
Well,
um,
and I think that that's I really appreciate that. That's a really great response. I wonder too, though,
to me,
it seems like it would imply a certain amount of intentional training, because, like you said, it's not usually the outsiders are not there for that part of it. The community checking oftentimes is team members that are doing that. It's not the consultant. And somebody recently, I was interacting with somebody that was like, "Oh, well, you can look at the detailed reports of the community checking," and I was like, what detailed reports? Because I've never heard of that in an oral translation where, the usually for what I've seen, when the community gives feedback, the team, if there's something they need to address, they address that, and then what the consultant sees is the product that comes from that process, not a detailed written report of all of the interaction that happened. And so I wasn't aware of that happening in other places, but you guys are working in different contexts. Maybe I don't know Nelson or Austin or Rob, if you have seen that kind of thing in your process, or if it's you're seeing the end result of the conversations that came out of the community checking.
Yeah, it's very interesting because when I read here, it was a sentence. So OBT requires additional checking steps before it is to be submitted to a consultant. So the name is the same that we could read in a paper about written translation, but this kind of submitted, so the kind of submission is really different. So I, as consultant, I have no control about every question or every uh, part of the process that will be guided in the community check. And um, so we need to build a kind of relationship with the translation team because we need to trust in the translation team
Mhm.
because they will have the locals will have more freedom to look and to decide what kind of questions or what kind of um, uh, feeling. This is a kind of mother tongue feeling about the language, And this is the kind of genius of the language, the kind of spirit, the thing that I cannot catch or precise describe, but the mother tongue instinctively, naturally, they have this from born. And
Yeah.
and so this is very interesting because when I have my first experience with the Sertanejo project in Brazil, a dialect, a Brazilian dialect. So the translation team asked me, so what kind of questions we could drive this community check? And I had naturally a list, and they said, no, this don't works. This don't work in our area. And it's a kind of thing outside of the box because so it's we need to have a kind of flexible methodology and um, yeah, I think the core that is not explicit in this paper, but the core question is about hierarchy and how the role of the consultant changes in this OBT procedures.
And for me, I've never seen any of the written transcription of the community check. Um, it just isn't practical because
Right.
I'm 2 languages removed from the target language, and so they would have to transcribe from the target language into the LWC, and then from that into English, and it's hard enough to get a good back translation, let alone try to get a transcription of
Yeah.
the community check. So it's just not practical.
Yeah.
But I do try to, again, encourage them to spend, more time and try to do the community checking more efficiently. Because when it comes to me as a consultant, and it looks like it hasn't been community checked, then I really wonder, well, how much community checking did they do?
Well, and I think too, going back to what Nelson was saying about the changing role of the consultant, I think that part of the community owning the process and the responsibility for the community checking, there has to be nothing that we do happens in a vacuum. Like it has to be a conversation, a dialogue. It should always be all the players in the project or the team having conversations talking about what does this look like? What's going to work in your area? Because like Nelson, we come in with our list of questions or our things that we think are going to be important, and we need to spend all this time working on. But they may not be exactly what's needed in the community. So it has to be a dialogue. It has to be informed, not just but with that innate sense of, oh, this is my culture, this is my language, and so I know. But as an insider, we also have blind spots that we're not thinking about, and so having somebody from an outside perspective who can give you things to think about, it's from both sides where it's important to have both that understanding, that intimate understanding of the culture and the language, but also somebody from the outside who can connect the pieces and say, hey, we need to think about these things, and it being a conversation altogether.
So in other way, other invisible thing that's very important for this paper. So it's most important for the quality assurance, very well community check than back translation. And he don't talk about back translation as basis to quality assurance. So a comprehension about the community check is better to understand if the people are understanding the translation properly and with accuracy. And this is a kind of switch of the priorities that I can see in these ideas of this paper.
And do you think that's, oh, go ahead, Rob.
I just wanted to respond to something Nelson said about trust and trusting the translators, and I appreciate the comment very much. I think also it implies that there's significant buy-in on the part of the translation team to the OBT process and to a community check of this nature. Because this isn't, what I'm looking, I'm reading this and I'm thinking, this sounds like Robin Green circa 2013. Like there's some like idealism in this, right? That I really love and appreciate. I don't mean idealism in a bad way. So I'm not meaning to belittle it, but this idea that like we get back to the beauty of oral communication, like we talk about these things. We're really focusing on the audience's responses. We're asking the questions, how do your, maybe I'm just a little jaded by working on a multitude of projects as a CIT. But, asking these questions. For example, I was on a project where pacing was a concern, and I was asked to prioritize the questions that I asked and which questions fall by the wayside. Unfortunately, there are often these types of discourse feature type questions, that are important, but when they're like, 5 verses an hour, let's get this moving. And so I'm reading this and it's giving me some freshness in this, but I think it ties to the translation team really has to be bought in because it's so easy for these pressures to come in and then to say, well, we don't have time to worry about if we, are using the correct markers or, we really start a story this way. It matches the Greek. Let's go with it. So I appreciate that he gave me this kind of freshness, and thinking through these things. But it reminds me that the team has to be bought in to an oral process, to a multimodal process. They really have to be willing to push through and say, these things are important. It also reminds me that, and we talk about changing role of a consultant, and I think that it's important for a consultant to read this and to understand. I think this is a good article for consultants to read, to understand the kinds of questions that if the community are asking these questions, these are things to be considering. And it makes me want to have a UNS at my consultant checking session, to be able to ask some questions to somebody who wasn't one of the translators. And I haven't had that on any projects. And I'm going on a soapbox now, but I think this reinforces for me that consultants need training in OBT if they're going to be checking on oral projects.
So Robin, you say you haven't had any UNSs in your consultant checking on the projects you've been on?
Rob, I can barely hear you. I don't know if there's a setting
Yeah,
or
hold on and let me check my sound settings and then I'll come back.
I can hear you, Rob, if I don't know if that.
maybe it's me.
So you said you have not been involved.
I have not had a UNS on any of my checking projects.
Okay, well, I'm surprised about that because all the projects that I'm involved in, that have been involved in, there's been UNSs, and I have, been pretty adamant about that just because of the fact that I don't know how well they're doing the consultant checking. And so I want to make sure that there's a UNS there that I can, get.
Or the community checking.
The community, I'm sorry. I don't know how well they've been doing in the community checking. And so for the consultant checking, I want to make sure at least there's one or two people that are going to be able to give me some feedback. And then I wanted to mention one other thing about the community checking. On page 24, the middle of page there, he says, in OBT, it is especially the community that's responsible for testing the accuracy, clarity, and naturalness of the translation. Now, I disagree with that, but then later in the page, later in the article, he changed that and he said that it's the community that's responsible for the clarity and the naturalness, and the translation consultant that's responsible for the accuracy. And there I agree with them.
Yeah.
And so when they're doing community checking, I tell them that when you're doing community checking, nobody is supposed to be having an open Bible there and reading their Bible and comparing what they're hearing with what the national language says.
Yeah.
No, that's not the purpose of the community check.
Yeah. Good points, Rob. Thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah, Nelson.
this is kind of a thing that I realized in this paper too. So the author don't spoke about the problems that he had in the translation, just the good things. But he gave a risk of this when he spoke about the use of onomatopoeias and other things. So yeah. So it's the page 29. So about the narrative tests and the testers. So the testers, he or she needs to know how to recognize logical, temporal, and locative conjunctions, the functioning of linking words for continuity or discontinuity, and markers used for introducing characters. Ideophones, interjections, onomatopoeia, and exclamations may need to be added to make the text come alive, even if the source text does not have them. And then the basic phrase is using them at the right points facilitates concentration and engagement. So then I assume that he knew about using them at the wrong points, that not facilitations. And so maybe he had the knowledge in his project about the problems when testers uh, don't know properly how the culture works. So, and the discursive markers. So, in the tester is a very important, a key person to achieve the quality assurance in the project. So, I think this is the problem that so he or she, I don't know, but the author had using in the wrong points because he assumes this so openly. So this is experience, and I assume that so underlines. So it's between the lines is something here about the problems because I was asking what the problems. He is looking in the perfect project, but here so this is the problem.
Dirk had your hand there, hand raised.
Yeah, my video is not working, so sorry about that. But I think one of the things with oral Bible translation that things are a lot more organic. So some of these things, we cannot also presume that also the consultant always knows everything. Yeah, and certain things will come out as far as accuracy in community checking. But it's not a completeness of the text or some of these things. We need to look at the dynamics that are going on. What value is there in checking for the community that there is an aspect accuracy they can help us with? One, if something is theoretically accurately spoken, but it's not understood, it doesn't really help. Yeah. But that's what something the community can confirm as far as accuracy. Oh, yeah, no, this is clear. Yeah. So there's components in that accuracy that the community definitely can help with. But it's not indeed the completeness as you compare that, like you said, Rob, with, for example, a reference text that they're using out of a national language. And you don't want them to sit comparing for that purpose. Their whole purpose is to engage with that message and then through the questions, find out, is everything there? Is it accurate? Is anything added, changed, taken away? All these aspects we want to look at that point by basically comparing one telling next to another as well, where you just don't have one. And that's where I like to use live telling because then you really have people communicate. If you just have a recording, And as a matter of fact, believe it or not, I just came off a call from a team in Zambia that they are going through right now, and they're missing major pieces because their consultant had his own opinion. Yeah, and that consultant basically started to just ignore certain things,
Mm.
including, for example, a simple list of genealogy where names were not in order. Well, that's critical. Yeah, you can have the best system set up, method set up, but if the consultant is not functioning in a way that he should be serving that team, they'll end up with all kinds of errors. You're right, Rob, because the community doesn't know the order. But so there's all of these different things that I think tie into this. Likewise, with what you were talking about, Nelson, that, and we see that I think it's hard to express in, I think, a paper like this, hard parameters because every project I've been in, they continually shift. And my role as a consultant is, am I aware of shifting of these things and asking the questions to draw out and see what is really accurate, communicating it naturally, clearly, in an acceptable way. And so even adding things like clarifications, I have to be very careful because I, as a consultant with my theological background, may feel that it will help just to understand baptism a little better, for example. The moment I do that, what have I done? I brought in my theological preference, overshadowing the message of the text. Yeah, I need to let them wrestle with it, and that can best be done by questions. Asking them questions for them to process. Is it right there? Is it in the immediate context? Is it in the relevant context of the book, previous history? Be careful about future stuff because no, they didn't have it at that point. Yeah, so it's so easy for us to bring all these things in. Well, they should know Genesis 4 that, the basic domestic animals must be sheep because it's talking about Jesus as a foreshadowing. No, you can't do that. They didn't have any of that there. Yeah. Let it speak later when actually we come to Hebrews and then it starts to look back and then we say, wow, there's a broader picture here that we can now understand. But don't make that part of that first message. And I think that is where the beauty, if we find the context within, and ultimately the grand story, like if there's principles about God that are not working. And so that's when I read a paper, sometimes when we have certain methods and we try to follow, it will pinch. If I would write it, it will pinch equally. You'll say things and you say, Dirk, that's not going to work because it doesn't. Yeah, we need to keep coming back. God's Spirit leading. Are we willing to facilitate and allow them to wrestle to communicate this message? And without adding, if any way possible, any of these little things that later on actually can become an issue themselves. Can become a theology even. I mean, I was with one church in northeast Namibia, Salt Church. The simple phrase, we need to be the salt of the earth. They wear white robes, and if you sin, I spray salt water in your eyes. Yeah? Maybe properly translated. But that has become their foundation almost for all of Scripture. Why? Because as people, we have a tendency to single things out so we can manage. And God says, no, you can't manage me. You need to grow in that relationship with me and grow in understanding. If we model that as consultants and as people in these projects, we're achieving probably way more than we ever could ever otherwise. Because then we're setting them up in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. What do they need to do? They need to revise this because language changes. We're setting up, one, to be aware of that, two, to be able to do that. And I think those are key aspects that we need to remember in that.
Okay. I've heard Dirk talk. I've also had Robin talk as well. I know that I may be mistaken, but I believe that a lot of their conversation began from certain aspects of the paper, and then they moved it to other general things, especially when it has to do with consultants, the role of consultants. And I like the fact that Robin specifically pointed out that if a consultant has to do OBT, they should be trained in orality enough to do their consultant check-in as not really basically oral specialists, but people with a high sense of orality, and not only look at it from the written perspective. Maybe I didn't get all of that, but I was thinking that that's what she meant when she said consultants should be specially trained to do OBS, OBT. Now, but the truth of the matter, and some of this was what we were discussing with Chris before the meeting all started, is that the truth of the matter is that there are not many consultants they are not, in fact, okay, well, let me say it this way. For most of the standard BT organizations like SL Nigeria, there are not many OBS consultants. OBS consultants that are set, or OBT consultants that have been trained and certified to be able to carry out consultant work. However, we see other, we don't really, smaller or mushroom BT organizations, and they can have up to 5 consultants, people that are said to be consultants. And in all honesty, sometimes when we look at what they do and evaluate it, we just wonder and shake our heads. So what do we do in this reality? What do we do in this situation where we know that we need consultants to be properly trained to carry out this work? But on the other hand, there seem to be a lot of consultants doing the work, or people that bear the title of OBS consultants and OBT consultants, but yet they're actually the main problem of the work. What do we do? That's one question. Then I like, sorry, was somebody trying to respond to that?
No, I think it's you. You're good.
Okay. So I like how and I'm going to read something from the conclusion. It says, the production of an oral text should not begin with a written text. The process should be from oral to oral. Oral translation begins with an oral study of the text and ends with an oral product. The translator appropriates the text orally, and all research and drafting is done orally in order to ensure that written style doesn't slip into the oral text. Now, yes, that is what we expect to happen in orality and in OBT. But I can also tell you for a fact that most of the oral texts, in quotes, that have been produced by some of these mushroom companies, mushroom translation houses, or the smaller translation houses that we have in Nigeria, I can tell you for a fact that some of the oral translations are actually almost like people reading their regular Bibles in whatever language they are producing. So for instance, like Hausa, and all the different performance features of orality that we expect to ensure that that text is oral in its sense, it's almost missing, and you are getting the person read like a newspaper. What do we do then in order to ensure that we don't have what I would term as charlatans now messing up the work, such that 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, and that's one of the problems we're having in SIL Nigeria. People look down on the work of orality because it's almost looking like there are really no standards for it. How do we ensure that this doesn't happen and that orality is given its pride of place in Bible translation efforts?
Excellent questions. I think it might be easiest to start with the first one. The idea that we want to incorporate training for people who are doing consulting in OBT. It's something that's happening. We're working on developing those kinds of things. But part of it has to be, we talk about multi-modality, but we also need to think about multi-organization, because each one of the organizations has a different flavor, has a different perspective on certain things, and bringing those things together, I think will result in a better training rather than if we just say, okay, this is SIL's OBT method. Okay, this is Spoken's OBT method. This is Seed Company's OBT method. I don't think that's as helpful. I think if we can work together and bring those different ingredients to the recipe, I think that's going to help make it a better end result. Because when you talk about wanting to have standards, it's important that we have buy-in from each of the different organizations because as they're able to speak into that process, instead of dismissing the other organization saying, oh, well, they do it differently, and so we don't do it like that, it would be much richer if we can involve them in the development of the training, so that we can have something that is good and acceptable among the community of BT or OBT practitioners. I think that's important for how do we get there? How do we do that? It has to be lots of different organizations and people speaking into it. Um, I'll pause there because I had questions about your second part that I wanted to bring up, and so I think that could be a separate discussion. But what do the rest of you think about that first question?
Yeah, I can speak to that since I brought this up in the first place about consultant training. I think that first, so yes, it's your concerns are legitimate, and it's difficult to know how to proceed from what's happened in the past or to, but all we can do is say from here we can go forward and maybe implement some changes. And one change that I would recommend is that every CIT be required to get experience in a multimodal project, an OBT project, OBS, that to be a requirement, to have mentored checking, because a lot of times what's going to happen is that people are going to be pulled into OBT projects just because there's interest, but if there's no training, it's no substitute for interest. I mean, yeah, interest is not a substitute for training. They're both valuable. And so in my experience as a CIT, I have to, even though I will probably be mostly working in OBT because that's my area of interest, I have to get lots of training in print and written translation projects. But the converse is not true. I think there's one area where we can begin changing and begin advocating for consultants who are already certified. This is my suggestion. I know it's a hard one, and probably few people will agree with me, but I think if you are already a certified consultant whose only experience is in written translation and you want to work in OBT, you should have a mentored checking experience. I know consultants don't want to be mentored anymore. I get that, but it's something new. So I don't understand why the resistance would be there, to go with somebody who has experience in it, to work with them, to not just work on your own, but to have someone there who can guide you. Those are my suggestions.
Yeah.
Oh,
I
thank
would
you,
like
Robin.
to I would like to speak to that if I could. And I am in that exact situation that Robin just mentioned. I've grown up in text. I am text leaning oriented, but I have tried and tried and tried to get some exposure to oral strategies. And it is like bashing up against a brick wall to find opportunities for that. I find the oral world is really difficult to get into, and I'm not blaming anyone in particular for
I would
that. And
ask
I
a
wish,
question, is that I hear you, and is that I'm wondering if that is specific to Seed Company, because we don't have as many projects, and I got OBT experience outside of Seed Company as a CIT, because we didn't have a lot of projects.
and I am also a member of the seed company, and I can't speak to what goes on outside of the seed company. Uh,
So Chuck, I just posted in the chat an image of a training workshop that's going to be happening in Chiang Mai in November. Um, and this is multi-organizational. It's Evelyn Gann with Wycliffe Malaysia, that's with Wycliffe Global Alliance, is one of the instructors. She shared that with us the other day. So if this is something that might help start or satisfy the itch that you have to get started. So there are things like that that I wasn't aware of them either until I was in a meeting and somebody mentioned it, and I was like, "What? How can I get information about this?" I mean, I talk to people all the time, and I would love to be able to point them towards something that already exists while we're trying to develop more things. Dirk, you have a hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. And like I said, I'm sorry, I don't have a video. I see that somebody else joined. Just want you to know that I'm not trying to hide. But our approach is completely incarnational. And whether somebody has a background in how many years doesn't really matter. It just will then show how well you progress as you start to relate to it. One example is Nelson on this. He's a high academic coming from an area that basically, in some areas he would run circles around me. But in other areas, he was just interested and got involved in a practical project and started to learn. And then things, even from within his natural culture, that are old, start to suddenly bubble back up, and they start to become more relevant because suddenly we're outside of that bubble. Now, I remember earlier, Aaron SAL was doing pilot projects, and just about every one of them, I remember we were doing with Seed Company these meetings, was like, okay, it didn't really go well. People didn't really like it. Well, it was done still like, we need to fly. But if you're only used to an airplane with a wing, and that's what you're trying to do every time, it's not going to work. Yeah, so to basically start in the same fashion as a literate project and deal with the same, yeah, essentials and methods often too, as well as like, for example, they were choosing people, how, where to start, what to do. It was all a teaching, also bringing it in instead of simply coming alongside, recognizing that God is journeying with the people. Can we come alongside as catalysts and help them within their natural way of communication, allow God's word to start communicating and become part of their community? Now, for many people, that's too organic, but that's what it needs to be. Then we can find relevant structures that they will often find too in there that will help them to do it better. And typically, again, I don't tell them, I ask them, okay, what will work for you? So I don't come with a method up front. That's, I think, one of the biggest things. The moment I have a method, you're going to have to adapt to Dirk. And that's not what it's about. I need to adapt to the people that I'm serving because God is going to meet them where they're at. He's well capable. He's also not made his word that big a mystery. If we still have that, then nobody can even read an English Bible and understand it because if we have that much trouble translating it to another language. But if we start with the simplest passages with people that don't have exposure and allow them to grow naturally as in a puzzle, piece by piece to what they understand better, the same way they then will start to grow and we'll find actually just about every project, and one project we have 4 people even, that are ready to become consultants because of their qualities that are locally there. But it's not going to be an academic level. It's going to be at an organic level, and that's where we need to set our standards. We have been working with one of those mushroom companies that we are, trying to get some of these things actually in order so it really, we recognize we're growing, okay? We're making mistakes, plenty. But we're growing, and what does it look like to be able to come alongside to see the role of consultant slightly different than a traditional way is coming in and making a final signature and making check. No, it's a journey with the people to actually empower them to do a large part of this consulting. That's also where consultants that need to be trained need to come alongside. And that's why we do incarnational training, because people experience what goes on. And as you experience it, it's totally different than reading a book and having a theory about it. And that was continually also the challenge with the SAL projects earlier on. They were asked to do this. Some of these guys didn't even, they admitted in their reports, they didn't want to do it. But it did it anyway, and they gloriously saw that it failed. Why? Well, they were flying with wings. They needed a helicopter. But they never thought about making it a helicopter. They kept the wings, and they needed always that runway. So it's that same method of looking at it for a print perspective. and yet wanting to serve oral preference communicators. That doesn't work. And even then, we need to be broad enough that we can let go and say, okay, if they want print with it because it is functional for them, that we can help them and send them, if needed to some help that can help them do so, but also not mandate that for them too. Oh, they need to have print too. It doesn't work. We need to see what is sustainable for them. And then again, that's all an organic approach, I think. And just in responding to you, Amika, there is possibility to help people. Yes, we're growing all in there, but I think talks like this will help us to grow and see what's possible. How can we all do better?
And Emma, I would say too, maybe we could connect and have a conversation with Tim Hunter, because he's with Spoken. He does work in Nigeria as well, right? Okay. Yeah, so maybe we could connect and have a conversation outside of this group to see how we can try to make some connections there in Nigeria, to see what's already available in trusted spaces, and try to start there. Because like you mentioned, it's one of those things where there has to be maturity going forward. We start where we can, and then we move forward is how we'll eventually get there, I think. Austin, you had your hand raised.
Yeah. Has somebody written or presented something like a presentation on the difference between consulting as an OBT consultant versus a written consultant? Or should somebody who's an academic, maybe even in this meeting, write that paper so it can serve as a resource and draw out some of the differences? I'm not aware if that's already been done. And then secondly, I was going to say we have some partners in Indonesia, and they've suggested some ladies join the Spoken Mentoring Program to become a CIT in OBT. They're written consultants, but they recognize they don't have expertise in consultant checking and leading oral projects. But it was interesting because another sister OBT organization that we know and we probably all partner with had told them they don't need to be certified as an OBT consultant because they're certified as a written one. And if you're certified as a written, it's above and kind of includes everything that an oral already does. But it was surprising because that ministry is at the forefront along with us with OBT. And so, but even they recognized, we don't think that that's true because we've sat in certain things and realized they're doing things with different nuances than a written translation does. And so, I say all that to say perhaps there needs to be even a conversation among YWAM, FCBH, SIL, Spoken, all of those doing OBT, Rhema for the Nations to get on the same page about, okay,
Yeah,
what are the differences? And then what qualities are necessary for an OBT consultant versus a written consultant?
right.
Because I wouldn't say just because you can do written that you're automatically an expert in OBT.
Right. And I would say, so I know that conversations have happened. I don't know if there's been like an official presentation of things, but I know it's come up in several things. But that was something that was brought up in the Brazil consultation about maybe it's time to revisit the discussion of developing best practices for OBT. And I agree. I think that is something that's necessary. And it's something that I'm hearing from several different places. So maybe it's time that we organize something like that where we come together and have a working group to put forward some ideas, and then share them with the community and the group to get feedback, so that we can try to have something to move forward. I think it's something that OBT has reached a level of acceptance and maturity in its process that there is. I think there is enough data that we could say these are best practices that we see and recognize, and we can move forward. Now, it doesn't mean that this is going to be this is in stone. This is what you have to do. But best practices these are things that we've seen that we recognize should be incorporated, and I think that's a good, healthy place to be. So thank you for that reminder. So going back to Emika's second question, about the oral to oral. So that I had that same question, Emeka. So what does this mean, oral to oral? Because when the source text is not oral, you're having to start from a written to get to an oral. But I think that what he's saying is that it's not necessarily about the source text, but it's how you're accessing the source. And so he mentions oral Bible study, oral exegesis, to do that. And so I think, yeah, I mean that's a great question. What do you think? What does it mean to do oral exegesis, and what does it mean to do from oral to oral for oral translation, especially when you're in a context where the sources aren't necessarily oral? Dirk.
Yeah, every project I've been involved in since the beginning, yes. Typically, they needed what? A reference and sources, not necessarily one, because that's another danger too. If you take a regional language and they had translated like a good news Bible, you're already starting with a reference that basically may need some details actually adjusted because it's gone to sometimes, more adding some clarification, or even, I've seen texts where clearly some theological ideas come forward. But the idea is, and we did it with one project, we started simply with somebody who knew the language of wider communication, not, if possible, me in English, to be able to communicate that orally. So that person had internalized that message already, that had been checked, that really was communicating orally, and then going from there to their other language. So starting right away with orally communicating, not following a text and unpacking that text as a team. And then allowing people to internalize it. Not memorize, but internalize. So make it there so they can communicate it. Yeah. If I basically memorize something, it's theory. It's trying to get words. I remember we did an early check in Dallas about a very early version of Render, and basically there was the Lord's Prayer that needed to be changed, and just for practice. And so we made some changes to that, brought it back to the team, and basically there was a gal who had actually narrated it before, but she couldn't do anything with the changes because she had memorized it. She never internalized it. So she could repeat all the words perfectly, but the moment we started to make a change, it didn't work because the message was not hers. And that is foundational. That starts to happen. The first thing, the message needs to become something that communicates that we can make ours, and then we can start basically massaging it. And that's where we look at these references that often are in print. And if there's any oral front translations, we're working right now with Spoken Worldwide one in Myanmar in the national language. So the minority languages can start with a more oral front translation. Yeah. So those it's just my thoughts in that context.
Thank you. Doji?
Okay. I think from oral to oral, I would like to share my experience with OBS and OBT. So I have been OBS trainer with story runners for some years before joining Faith Comes by Hearing. So in order to have this oral to oral path, we used to have someone record the written translation for the translators to use as the source text in order to not be reading when they want to draft the stories. So, and the trainer is like an ethical resource for the translators, and sitting with them, talking to them, answering their question about exegetical problems that they might face during the process of developing. And like Dirk said, they need to internalize the text. They need to internalize what they hear as the source test in order to be able to retell it naturally in the language. And I do appreciate what the FIA resources that is being developed now, so that the resources also will be available in oral form or audio form for the translators to use. When I joined Falcons by Hearing and started training with them, I realized that they were using almost the same approach as the OBS strategy, using audio Bible versions for the translators to use. Later on, when I started working, I realized that many people have been criticizing this approach because from the beginning, we don't allow translators to be using resources in parentheses or logos to by themselves, but we ask the exegetes to do this job on their behalf and help them orally to fill in the blank. But later on, I realized with some projects here in Benin that after some trainings, they were allowed to use resources in Parates and also in logos. So I don't know yet how that impacts the naturalness, the naturalness and the accuracy of the translation so far. But I think using this strategy like Audio Bible and having oral or audio resources for translators will help to do this oral to oral approach. Thank you.
Thank you. Nelson has a hand raised, and I just want to mention that it is 9, or we've reached an hour, so I recognize that if people need to go, I understand that. If you are available and want to keep going, the conversation is really going well, and so I hate to stop it in midstream, but I do recognize that people are busy, and so if you have to leave, we understand. But go ahead, Nelson.
That Yeah, so I think from oral to oral is not pure oral, and I think the first translation that we need to begin before the OBT is from written to oral, looking for an oral exegesis, and I think this is very important for accuracy because this is the kind of very hard point to achieve the better comprehension. So the translation team need to have a perfect internalization because from a very good oral exegesis, they can flows naturally to an oral product, so with quality. I don't know if this makes sense, but
Yeah.
I just felt a little bit problems. So I would like to see the problems that he had with this. He spoke about a case study and illustrates something about translation and choices, but I saw no real problems that they had with about quality.
And I think the whole point of this this article, based on the name for sure, is community participation in OBT quality assurance, and the idea that it shouldn't just be, and I'm not saying that in written projects or in other projects that it's only the consultant that is the only quality assurance. I don't believe that at all. But I think that the emphasis or bringing to the forefront the community not just participating, but really, really engaging with the quality assurance and making sure that we're remembering that. Yeah, Rob.
Yeah, so I'm working with a new cluster project in Southeast Asia. And the project coordinator is serving as one of the translation advisors for one of the teams. She is working with the other translation advisors to produce front translations. And so those are oral, and those are being checked by myself and colleagues. And so we're able to give them some feedback on those front translations so that they have a better start for their drafting than they would just trying to read a national language translation. So that seems to be working pretty well, but that takes a lot of time.
I've had this conversation recently where people are so focused. I say people. There are organizations, there are people, there are certain individuals that are so focused on speed and that being the value, whether or not they say that, what they're expressing through the requirements for things is that speed is the highest value. And I just really don't think that's the case because they ask, well, how's OBT going to make this faster? How's AI going to make this faster? And I think that's not necessarily where we should be focusing. I think engagement and transformation is much more important than how fast we can do it. Because if I can quickly get you something that's not that great, I don't think that's as good as slowly working. I don't want to say slowly, at the right pace, working through the process in a way that is engaging for the community as well as for the team. I think that's much more important in the process. I think that should be a value.
Right. And also good training. You can't
Yes.
get good training if you're trying to rush through it,
Yeah.
especially at the beginning.
Yeah. Dirk, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, no, I agree with both of you because it's so essential. What is it really about? Is it that we want to come alongside, see God glorified among people? Then we need to allow them to journey with God, because ultimately they will have to continue journeying after we leave as well, or even if we don't show up, God can journey with them. So we need to be then a catalyst or aspect that will help that. What is helping is often serving them within their context, what their needs are. And that is indeed a total different perspective than trying to say, okay, we took another language off the map that we now have, quote, finished, and then only to find out that there is actually two different dialects when we should have done. We come up with all these practical things. But if there's a hunger that we are meeting and we're building capacity, and that hunger is so great, and I've seen it happen actually in one area, where then people will go to the neighboring dialect themselves because they have family members there. And they will start because they can do it. We have empowered them from day one to do it in a way that is functional for them instead of a method that's functional for us that we're trying to pass on. And then we're giving ownership of something that actually is designed by us. If we can come alongside and be those catalysts asking the questions, allow God to work in that. And you're right, Rob, that takes more time. But also what you see start to happen, you start to see a real community most of the time develop that is way deeper in understanding and engaging with the scriptures because they can now. Yeah. And that's also where I think panorama or the stickman concept that I've been sharing before is very foundational because you need to help people where they can start relating to God, whether it's a hunger, whether it's something relevant in their life. And then, like a puzzle, like I said earlier, keep adding to that. And that previous knowledge also will help them to work on the next piece. But if we start all over, we do complete books, start with Gospel of John, we never even looked at the Old Testament. What does it mean in the beginning? Yeah, the Word was with God, the Word was God. Huh? Now I need to explain, and I suddenly start at my theoretical rhetoric as a theologian to explain something that they need to discover. Because the moment they discover it, it's going to take way deeper root, and that's also where the worldview changes. Otherwise, we still keep, okay, their worldview has not really changed. We only put another religious veneer over their culture. No, if they start a journey with God, God right from day one will start to change their worldview. But it takes for us to take a humble position, even as consultants. We're not over it. No, we're actually under or next to them just by basically growing together.
Yeah, thanks. Rob? I think you're muted,
Rob, you're
Rob.
muted.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, my machine's a little slow there. Yeah, and as far as training, for me, ideally, an OBT consultant should have experience working with working on an oral project as a translation advisor first.
Mm.
And to me, that would be ideal. But unfortunately, that's probably not going to happen for most OBT consultants because there's such a great demand and need that people are just being rushed into the role of an OBT consultant. I think that's a big part of the problem.
Yeah.
That the demand is so great that people are just being, shoved into the role without adequate training.
Yeah, that's where we really focus on the mentoring aspect, incarnational, where people are part of not only necessarily one project, they're being shadowed by somebody else right from day one. And yes, that may be a function of simply a translation coordinator or whatever it is, whatever level they start at. And then allow it to progress with checks and balances in place where we see their capacity. And we've seen people train others now at different levels, and not necessarily people just like Nelson with a PhD or so, but also people that not necessarily even don't have a college degree whatsoever, but their aptability, their aptitude, the way that they are able to engage sometimes far succeeds some people that have lots of experience and lots of training. Why they experience and they get it and their heart is ready to engage with it. And even then, we stay with people trying to keep growing, a growth plan. Because, see, if we don't have a growth plan, even for Dirk Meyer, however how long he may have been involved, you know, it's like if we don't grow, we'll start to die. And I'm learning actually from all the different people every time we meet together, even from Nelson. No, I'm just teasing, but I do. But I mean, but Amber, she's joined our team. She's also from Spoken Worldwide. And I glean from her as she gets experiences. And that's the beauty of it, because there's so much to learn because people are so diverse and yet the principles are the same. But how can I help somebody think of some other creative way? And that's the catalyst coming alongside a project. And that's also, I think, the beautiful value of discussions like this, Chris, where we can get the opportunity to rub shoulders with others from other organizations that have different experiences and read things from other people that have gone through other things and, yeah, all grow together.
Yeah, for sure. And so I think the thing that when we talk about community participation, community ownership of the process, I think that scares some people because, when we talk about what is church-based Bible translation and the idea that, more of the ownership should be at the local level, I think that causes fear for some people because they think, oh, but they don't have the training, they don't have XYZ. And I think that's why there needs to be the dialogue. There needs to be the conversation. It's not just saying, okay, the local church is now the one in charge of everything. Instead, it should be a partnership where the consultant who has these years of experience and training is speaking into that process so that the local church is growing in their capacity to be able to do these kinds of things in a way that is healthy for passing, not just passing on the work, but for us as the church, Big C, working together so that we're able to do these tasks in the local communities in a way that is not just an outsider saying, yes, this meets my standard, but instead it's a conversation to grow towards something better, I think. And that's the conversation that needs to be happening. Nelson.
I just would like to talk about this fear that I hear many times, I listen many times about the fear about OBT because the locals has not the conditions or the features to achieve quality or accuracy. And the example that he said in the case study and in the 29 page, so a few days later, Jesus went back to Capernaum. And he said something that let me question that because he said, where they are known in the source test. So uh, translators are encouraged to use idiomatic expressions. And for me, this is not something new because in English we have a few days later. This is not in the Greek text. The Greek text in the original, without variations, all manuscripts are the same. We have the expression truth of the days. And we saw not this expression exactly here in the consecrated English. And so, and some things that we had in OBT. So we are usually to have in written tradition, but we are so I don't know. No, in written, this is really accurate and with quality and perfectly oriented for the source. Uh, but when we talk about OBT, no, this is dangerous. We cannot use the local expressions. We have to have a caution about it. And this is a kind of prejudice that we all that work with OBT we have sometimes. So this kind that we don't have the same accuracy that the written because we have no control as consultants as in the written tradition. But it's not true because when the people understand, so international, so with the body, with the mind, with the heart, the meaning of the source text in an oral way, in the way that they can comprehend. So naturally, they will and want to express
Mhm.
the more accurate form in his own language.
Well, and like you said, we bring our own biases of what we're used to our own work. But I think one thing that that made me uneasy when I was reading this uh, is on page 26 when he was talking about the OBT processes and quality goals. When he talks about oral translation using improvisation. When I
Mhm.
hear that, that kind of is scary in the sense of some of the people who argue against OBT and orality and things like that say, well, it's not, it's not translation, it's stories. And I think the use of the word improvisation there makes
Mhm.
people uneasy because they're like, oh, wait, they're not just doing the Bible. I mean, they're improvising. And I think it's what he's getting at is the idea of being able to contextualize for the local community in a sense. And I think that maybe when you're talking about translation for performance, where they've internalized the text, and it's not that they're changing the text or the story, but what they're doing instead is giving flavor that is like he was talking about the onomatopoeia and the things that make it come to life. That I'm okay with, but when you talk about improvising, I'm like, whoa, wait, that makes me uneasy. What are we talking about here?
And I think this is a kind of prejudice because in orality, they have rules. So when we talk about an expression, so they have local rules to tell a story or a historically accurate story about a kingdom or about a god. So, and in the orality, they have rules. So it's not improvisation. It's a kind of glossary and thesaurus,
Yeah.
but everything is oral.
Well, and another thing to keep in mind is that this text was originally written in French and then translated by somebody else.
Oh,
Um, and so that may also influence choices. And Doji, I don't know if maybe coming as a French speaker, you might be able to. Is there any kind of nuance to improvisation there, or maybe not? I don't know. Um,
Yeah, even myself, when I was reading it and I read improvisation, it was a little bit yeah, scary for me, but I finally understand it in the paragraph where he talked is on page 27 when he said in addition. Then he talked about if like rhetorical questions, differences, logical connectors, ideophones. So I think he is, for the understanding I had, is that he is talking about things that we can see in oral translation that cannot be written, like uh, these ideophones, in some languages. When telling stories, people will use a lot of ideophones, but in written, it will sound very strange. So that's my understanding of the improvisation that he's talking about. But I said last night when I was reading this article, I said, if I can get the French version, I will be very happy to, yeah, I will understand better
yeah.
what he is saying in improvisation.
Well,
Thank you.
his email is on the first page, so if you write to him, I'm sure he would be able to send that to you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah. Dirk, you had a hand raised.
Yeah, you were talking earlier about indeed the message itself and how sometimes as a consultant, I remember that tension between oral communication and what literally it should be saying. I have two examples that were actually real examples in projects that I was part of. One of them was where within the genre of languages, the consultant felt that an expression they were using was not accurate. The team explained and expressed that within their language, this way, this issue that maybe in related languages is not a challenge. As a matter of fact, this is a natural way. But the consultant still didn't want to accept it because he says, well, but in all these other languages, it is different. So he did not want to accept their, yeah, perspective. And so the consultant becomes the final say. The other one was where actually they had decided, well, we like the oral, but we're going to go back to sentence by sentence translation. And so they did. And they did the story of Genesis 11, 1 through 9, the story of Tower of Babel. I was there actually to check a very early version of Render because they wanted us to see if people could manage the software. So I was sitting down with teams that had been working before 2 years earlier, and we did complete oral internalization of passages. And this is 2013, somewhere around there to 2017, that period. And basically, during our checking, I said, "Well, hey, how about you just then tell this story from Genesis 11?" He said, "Oh, we don't understand it." I said, "You don't understand it? It's a very simple passage, right?" I said, how is that possible? I thought you guys have finished it and it's consultant checked. Oh yeah, no, we back translated and all the sentences had the right information in it. But we don't understand and we tell it in the community they don't understand it either. I thought, okay, there is a problem where indeed we have left the aspect of communicating it orally and allow the expression in the context of the passage, yeah, to suddenly have reeled it back and bringing it to what it needs to be theoretically correct. And if it's theoretically correct, how correct it may be, if it's not communicating clearly and correctly, it is not. Yeah, it may have the right words in it and everything else. And that's sometimes a challenge that is not easy to navigate for a consultant who then has the background and feels like, but. And that's where typically my approach is I just ask questions. I'm not going to judge them and tell them. But out of the questions, if there's issues, they'll often find it. And then they will make the changes because they now discovered it. But if I keep telling them because I believe this is something, they do it because I say it. And they will do quickly. Why? I've got the consultant badge. They don't. Yeah. And that's why we have to be very careful. What does it mean to serve a team as a consultant? So we can be making ourselves responsible to God to help them to have the best quality message that communicates.
And I think that I know in today's reality, a lot of times there's going to be a preference for doing things over Zoom, doing things remotely. And I recognize that that is a reality of the economy and other things. But there's so much gained from being in person, having a relationship with the consultant. Um, you know, the consultant that we work with has been with our team. She's been to the community where we are and where they're working. She has been involved in their training from the beginning, and has been a part of the project since the very beginning. She came to the OBT launch training with Rob. He was one of our trainers, and being together and being yeah, just being together, sharing coffee, sharing meals, those kinds of things builds a relationship that just is so hard to recreate digitally or virtually. And there's just so much benefit to having those relationships. Um, and that allows them to be able to push back against when the consultant says, "Well, I think you need to change this," and they're like, "Well, but our culture would say this, and that was what that would mean." And then the consultant was like, "Oh, okay, well that makes sense," because they felt like they could push back. And so I think that that comes from that relationship and the deepening of it. So, Rob?
Yeah, and I agree with what Dirk said about the consultant's attitude and behavior, because I think one of the most important qualities of a consultant is that he be humble, along with translators and everybody involved in the project. So, at least in the C company, we're moving from a paradigm of quality control to quality assurance. So, previously, consultants were considered to be the quality control people. They're the ones that had the final word, and they're the ones that would tell the translators, how they needed to translate. Um, and they use a lot of times they use what we call consultant notes to write notes to the translators and give them suggestions on how they ought to change things without even investigating and asking questions. So, like Dirk says, I think we, as consultants, we need to be asking more questions, being more sensitive to understanding, why the translators are translating the way they are. And then if they don't understand things, helping to explain them, but not making suggestions generally until they ask for suggestions.
Well, guys, this has been great. We're at an hour and a half, so I don't want to take up your whole day, but this has been great. Thank you for participating. Thank you for engaging with the article. I sent out, well, I don't know if I sent out an email or if it's going to be in the next newsletter for Translation News, but the next month the article is going to be Swapna and Robin Green's article about oral to print. I'll send out an email announcing that to everybody as well. So yeah, thank you again for participating. Thank you for being here.